Yeah, that being said, we're going to talk about kind of general tips first. And so with that, just some very, very kind of overall, just to kind of orient everybody to the basics and make sure we're all on the same page. First, past performance is going to be something that you want to make sure you're aware of. So make sure you're current on reports you might have with the CDFI fund. Make sure you've been in compliance with the fund. The fund's not going to consider applicants with previously executed agreements for awards if they've determined you're non-compliant or notified you that you were ineligible. And the submission this year is going to be much the way it was last year, kind of with the new update. So make sure that you kind of created and updated your information in AMIS. Again, it's going to be that grants.gov plus AMIS kind of application. So if you haven't already, and you haven't had that pleasure yet, try to familiarize yourself with the AMIS system. Again, make sure you have the right contact people in there, authorized users, etc., or set up the account if you're newer or a sponsoring entity. Perfect. And then the last piece is kind of with everybody, just make sure you're registered and updated in SAMS.gov, grants.gov, that you're as up to date. You haven't let anything kind of lapse in that area, just because when you need to kind of get that set up, that can hold you back in terms of trying to apply, and you don't want that to kind of be something that holds you up. One of the biggest things we also wanted to mention for the newer organizations or sponsoring entities looking at the NACA application is to make sure you have both an EIN number and a DUNS number. And then finally, just a reminder, because it's that wonky date again where it's right in between the whole NACA session, to submit your SF424 as early as possible. That due date is coming up March 24th, so we just want to make sure that we're kind of letting everybody know and reminding people as much as we can. And then again, because this is an orienting kind of coverage of the basics for those folks that are newer to the process, remember TA awards are $10,000 to $150,000 in your ask. FA awards, which is only for certified folks, you can ask from $150,000 to $1 million in funding. And remember, TA is for operational expenses. So eligible uses for operational expenses kind of around capacity building are personnel costs and benefits, professional service costs, travel costs, training and education costs, equipment and supplies. And then that FA can be used for lending dollars, loan loss reserve, and operational expenses associated with development services. And then with the FA ask, and we'll probably go more into this too, because you can see the range is $150,000 to $1 million. You know, we always say maybe lean more towards positive projections in your ask, because some of those amounts might get cut down some. So definitely be reasonable, but try to be kind of positively aggressive with the projections that you develop. And then finally, another big tip that we have that really sounds obvious, but is still really helpful, is read all the materials that the fund puts on their website around the application. It'll give you extra insight or direction. And if you can't read, all of them, especially try to focus on either the TA or the FA guide, depending on which application you're doing. I mean, we've looked at those guides, and they're actually really clear and helpful and give you a lot of good direction for filling out the application, and they also have really good tips that are actually really helpful as you answer each of the questions. So beyond the questions, the tips kind of give you a further idea of exactly what they want with each of those answers.
Yeah, to talk more about that, it's new in this year's FA guide, but there's little boxes in the FA guide that actually say tip, and they're really helpful, so we can't speak highly enough about those. Perfect.
Thanks, Caleb. Mm-hmm. And then just some final general kind of overview tips for writing a NACA application. Essentially, again, you want to have some both quantitative and qualitative data, facts and stories. There's pretty limited space for stories, so use maybe even extra space in other sections if you feel like it's appropriate, if it fits, even if it's a 1 to 2 sentence story, because you're working in the character counts. But we do want to make sure we also point out that you are probably going to balance it more qualitative than quantitative with your applications, because what we've been hearing from the fund is that they're actually focusing more and more on that hard quantitative data and less on the qualitative data. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're answering throughout the application. And then obviously use market data less than 5 years old where at all possible. That's just a good standard to kind of keep to. Make sure your AMIS tables are consistent with your narrative, that you're telling the same story in both of those areas. projections, with those, make sure you're demonstrating growth, impact, and need for the award. And I would recommend, or we all recommend, doing your financial projections first. It's one more thing you can be getting in the AMIS system and kind of out of the way, but then it also is going to inform your narrative, so it's good to kind of have that determination. Be specific and clear. I can't say that enough. I mean, you know, for instance, if you're saying, I wouldn't say approximately 70 people attended a financial literacy training. I would say we held X amount of classes and had 67 attendees. Like, I would be very specific with that. And then finally, I would say with the TA, the biggest kind of difference would be you want to connect your requested funds directly to growing your capacity throughout the whole application. And with the FA, you're going to show significant but believable lending growth, and then think carefully about your FA objectives, which is a new piece for that application.
Yeah, and I'll talk about those FA objectives more later on.
Perfect. Thank you. And then finally, we want to jump into AMIS next, and before we get to the narrative too, because AMIS is something that you're going to have to deal with regardless if you're doing a TA or an FA application. And I mean, most of these rules of thumb, they're going to apply regardless. So with this, I'm going to let Caleb kind of talk a little bit about the financials in AMIS.
So the first bullet we have on here is that you want your historic numbers that you enter into AMIS to match with your audited financials. And of course, this is if you have audited financials. If you just have internal financial statements, then you'll want to make sure that the numbers that you input to AMIS match those. And the only reason I outline this, like, it might seem like a basic thing, but there's the entry into AMIS can sometimes be a little difficult, and we actually think that some of the financial inputs are going to be a little different than last year, so that might even add a little bit of a piece that could create some confusion this year. So just make sure your inputs match the attachments that you upload. You're going to want to make sure that your projections are justifiable and they're in line with your historic numbers. So if you have some projections in there that are you know, really kind of crazy and not in line with how you've been lending the last 3 years, then NACA readers are going to look at that a little less favorably than numbers that are more in line with your historic trends. Another tip is that you want to make sure that your projected income and expenses are growing appropriately to align with lending projections. It's really easy to project lots of lending growth and then not project your operating expenses or your expenses to grow along with that lending, which is something that the NACA readers are going to be looking out for. And then the income makes more sense. Your interest income is going to be increasing as your lending projections do as well. You want to make sure that your projections meet the MAPS ratios, and I'll speak about this vaguely just because we don't know what the MAPS ratios are going to be yet. We know they'll probably be similar to last year's MPS ratios, but we don't know exactly what they're going to be yet. So one of the ones from last year is the net asset ratio, for example. You just want to make sure that your projections fall within the except the ratios that the CDFI fund outlines. And then second to last bullet on there is you're going to want to list your largest funders and diverse funding sources if possible. So, you know, if possible, list foundations and banks, grants, just so that the fund sees that they're not your only funding source. And then again, that last bullet there for emphasis is check your data entry to make sure everything in AMIS is correct.
Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, and then some just additional AMIS tips. I can't kind of say it enough because I already did, but follow the TA and FA guides because they're going to guide you in your AMIS entries as well, and they're going to be really helpful tools as you're going through this, especially, you know, because there's so many moving pieces in AMIS. This will help you kind of keep track of what you're doing and what you need to do. And then also you can use the NOFA as a checklist for different pieces as well, and that's going to be helpful with your AMIS entries. Again, double and triple check your entries. I think we'll probably say it later again in the webinar too, but you know, you don't want one number that you've entered in kind of one little section to end up getting rolled over and impact the MAPS ratios that they end up calculating or anything else. And so just because, you know, you're moving all those numbers from one piece to another, it's easy to make those errors. So just as much checking as you can around that as possible. double check your maps. We can't speak much about maps yet because we don't know what they look like because the fund hasn't released that. But when it does come out, double check your maps and see what they've calculated for you, what it makes it look like for you, and if there's anything that you're going to have to adjust in terms of even your narrative to speak to or anything like that. And then I know this again sounds obvious too, but if you run into issues with the system, call the help desk. We've been speaking to the CDFI fund too, and that's what they've been telling us. Like they're ready to answer questions, they're happy to answer questions, and they want you to ask those questions. So feel free to use the help desk for the technical issues that might come up, and then any other kind of application questions. And kind of any kind of other issues with the system. We can only control so much on our end, but we might be able to help if you have AMIS issues too. So feel free to call us through the process too, because we're happy to help, and we answer questions as they come along for you. And finally, another obvious tip, but don't wait until the last minute. That goes for the SF424 in case for whatever reason you have to update any of your systems, and that's going to take a couple of days. And don't wait till the last minute on the AMIS system. And just the way that the system is set up, this is especially important because one, the system really can still be glitchy, where it might be through no faults of your own. Everybody's going to be crowding in at the last minute, so that's going to affect your ability to submit and holding things up. And three, as they give you errors, as you kind of check through the application in AMIS before you can submit, they only give them to you one at a time. So you don't know what the extent is of what you're missing. If that's how you're kind of catching any last minute errors, it's going to tell you, there was one error, and then you'll fix it and go to submit again. Then it will tell you the next one and the next one and so on. So those are kind of reasons why, again, it's obvious, but try not to wait till the last minute to submit, and you'll feel a whole heck of a lot better stress-wise. Perfect. So we're going to jump right into the TA narrative part, and we're going to start with the scoring criteria for the TA, and then go into the narrative sections, and then do the same for the FA in that way, so that we can just kind of make sure we're being as thorough as possible. And we're covering everybody's needs, since it sounded like it was almost half mixed between like folks that were going to be writing TA and FA. And so I would say in the webinar that they did last week, the fund did cover how is my TA application reviewed, but I just wanted to briefly do that again before going into the narrative tips. So for TA applications, it's essentially a two-step process. The first step is the fund's going to determine if you're eligible to apply, and then they're going to review your budget narrative and AMIS entries. So it's pretty simple. All levels of review are done internally by CDFI fund staff. It's pretty straightforward. And then you can see it's pretty straightforward in the scoring too. So if you're an emerging CDFI certifiable or sponsoring entity, 75% of your application is going to be in the section 1, which is the certifiability kind of questions. And then 25% is going to be in section 2. And so kind of your heavy emphasis needs to be on how you're actually going to be working to either create a CDFI or get certified and kind of answer those questions. And then for folks that are certified and going for a TA application, it's split pretty evenly between the section 2 sections. That might vary depending on how many questions are in the sections in terms of the weight of each question, but roughly the sections are all, they're scored evenly. So that's something good to know when you're going into writing. So finally, I wanted to talk about these in their separate sections. So I was going to do it by section 1 and then section 2. So it's section 1. This is going to be for uncertified applicants only. The certified folks don't have to worry about it. You have a very short TA application. Again, the scoring, this section, if you're uncertified, is worth 75% of your application. So this is really where you want to put your focus. And again, that focus is on certifiability, because that's really, really what the fund wants to see. And that's something that you want to keep upmost in mind when you're writing. If you're writing to the fund, that's what they want to see. That's what you want your focus to be on. And so there are 5 questions in that section. You have mission, financing entity, target market, accountability, and development services question. And so before I go into that, I also wanted to touch on, especially because it's going to be newer folks that are doing this section, that again, there's really going to be also a heavy emphasis on how you're going to become certified within the required timeline. So it's 4 years for a sponsoring entity from the award date. You have 4 years to become, well, you have 1 year to create a CDFI, and then 3 years past that to have that CDFI become certified. And then if you're kind of a very emerging CDFI that's getting started and you're getting your first award, from that first award, you have 3 years to get certified. And so that's a timeline that you A, want to keep in mind, and B, that you want to be writing to, because you want to be able to speak to a timeline so that you're telling them you're going to meet their requirements and make that connection with each answer. Yeah, so I think that you just want to kind of think thoughtfully around that timeline. And then I see a question popping in, so I'm just going to pause really quickly. Portfolio expansion, how literal is this? DFI funding to serve its core business, 184 loans. Okay, and I see some of these questions. I see a question from Anna, and I'm guessing these look more like FA questions, so I'm going to keep these in mind and just kind of hold them to the end of Caleb's presentation, but we're going to make sure that we get to that question. Okay, Anna? So I'm going to hop right back into here on these sections for Section 1 and certified applicants. So for mission, you really want to have a good idea of who you want to serve or have started serving if you've already kind of gotten in the works, and what you want to provide in terms of products and services or have started providing. With this, really just try to be as clear as possible if you have a good idea. If you already have products and services, really be clear about those and how you're rolling them out. And if you don't have them yet, but at least you've started to devise what they'll be, try to really be as descriptive and clear about that as you can versus kind of vague and, I don't know what we're going to do yet. Or if you're really, not sure what you want to do yet, really speak to like, well, we've heard this from our market and we've heard this from our clients, and this is why we think we need to start. So this is our starting point around maybe these types of products, but we're going to do a market study to kind of really clarify and further develop these products. And so that's a way that you can kind of answer that question. And with the financing entity piece, with this, you want to discuss your plan and timeline to start lending or your lending activities thus far and your pipeline for lending. How are you going to determine that demand? That's something that you want to also be able to answer in this question. How are you tracking this? And you also want to kind of talk about specific steps you can be doing to get ready, what works best practices. So, maybe be speaking to things that are going to get you ready to be a financing entity. So, oh, we're developing loan policies, or we're getting underwriting training, or we're using a market analysis to determine our loan products and services, or, we're starting to build our pipeline. And so those are kind of things that you can speak to in that section. And then the target market for certified folks, you're also going to get a question on this. It's Section 2, Question 3. So I have kind of the same feedback around that question. This is pretty straightforward. You're used to this question from the previous NACA application. It's a description of the location, who you plan to focus on serving, or who you've already focused on serving. You can talk about any market studies here or make the request here to do additional market research. But really the important part is be specific. Have exact numbers of demand with numbers, dollar amounts of loans in the pipeline, inquiries, applications, market research, etc., wherever you can. The more specific you can be, the better, or how you will be kind of getting that information. And if you don't have some of this information, obviously you're just going to be pulling from census data or tribal department data or any other sources, partners, that kind of thing. And be as relevant with your data as possible here, that you're making sure you make a case for the need for your organization and making that connection with the data. So don't just data dump. Make sure you're picking those key pieces that are helping you tell your story and are relevant. And then finally, kind of talk about how that data is going to be, has informed or will inform the development of your products and services. Again, making that final connection. And finally, don't forget about market outreach in this piece. How are you getting word out to geographically isolated areas or lowest income areas, etc.? Kind of just making sure that you can also talk about just different sources of data too. And finally, another section is accountability. So this one's pretty straightforward. This is really all about board representation. Pretty much how are you going to select board members, and how are you going to have your board be reflective of the community you're serving. And so with this piece, you want to just make sure that you're really, especially because we're native CDFIs, you really want to be saying, things like, our board makeup might be X percentage, Native American, or X percentage tribal members, or we're only going to have X percentage, non-native folks on it so that we're still reflective of our community, or any way that you want to think thoughtfully about that. This is where you want to talk about that and be specific and be clear, just to make sure that you're meeting those accountability requirements, that your board is reflective of your community. And another piece that you can fit in there, if you have room in the character limit, is also the qualifications of your board members, how they're really going to be not only reflective of your community, but reflective of different pieces of operating a CDFI. So if you're doing small business lending, you have a small business owner on your board, or you have somebody who knows accounting or is a former banker or lender. And then finally, kind of talk about your plan to reach out to those board members, how you're going to recruit them. I think that's where you can really fill in that section, even though it seems pretty like it's not that meaty. I think that's how you can kind of put in a lot of really good information there. And then finally, development services. So what do you plan to offer or already offer? And if you're already offering, it's really great if you've been tracking your data and provide specific information, and be specific in your description of services and how they complement or will complement the lending. That's going to be big, is making that connection piece, not just talking about them in general. And if you're already operating but you don't have data, I would maybe talk about how you plan on starting to collect that data. And it's really going to be the same for everybody. You can talk about data management systems here too, how you market your development services, if you've surveyed folks for level of satisfaction or retention of information to kind of make sure that they're receptive to what you're doing. Again, if you're not doing this already, you can outline a specific plan or timeline or consultant services that you might need to help you with this, that will help you design or implement these services. And finally, just talk about any partners that are in place already or that you plan to reach out to. And then finally, section 2 is going to be all applicants. And so with this section, like I said, if you're a certified CDFI and you're going for the TA application, you're in pretty good shape. I've looked through it a couple of times, and it is much easier than it has been in the past, and pretty straightforward and not nearly as painful. So I feel like that's really good news I want to make sure I share. And really, it has 10 questions. And they're for everybody with some exceptions. So again, make sure you follow the instructions in the guide to know which questions you skip, and you don't waste any time. The key items from that I've kind of highlighted are strategic goals, record of success, financial performance, and projections and risks. But I'll kind of go through all the questions. And so for the strategic goals question they ask you, that's going to be question 1 in that section. Really the biggest thing is connecting specific strategic goals and your use of the award you want to get to building capacity to meet your goals, and then connecting how the use of the award is going to address your target market's needs and challenges. And so this is really important, I feel, as a section, and you want to answer it directly and give the big picture. List your strategic goals, be specific, even number-based if applicable. And an example of that would be like, let's say you're farther along as a certified CDFI and you're going for a TA application. You might say something like, we want to grow our loan portfolio, we want to build our capacity to grow a loan portfolio to X amount of dollars. And so if you can be specific, like if that fits, then definitely try to do that. Be simple and direct. I would pick the top 3 most compelling strategic goals. It's really hard to do 5 or 6 with the character counts they have, and it just kind of makes it overcomplicated. And you can reword them too to fit your application if you already have some strategic goals you think would fit. And if you don't have a strategic plan, you can just come up with some strategic goals for this application, because one of the key things I like to make sure to tell people is that, remember, these are strategic goals for this application. They don't have to be for your organization. They're not, holding your organization to these strategic goals. These are your strategic goals for this application. So just kind of treat them like that. And I think it'll make it easier for when you're trying to kind of form your question, the answers to the questions on those. And you can match your strategic goals organizationally. I'm just saying you don't have to. So that's just something to keep in mind. Financial health is a good strategic goal. So is lending. If you're not yet certified, or if you're a sponsoring entity, developing a CDFI is one of the goals you'll want to put. Getting certified is a goal you'll want to put. So those are kind of things that you can kind of think of as ideas for these strategic goals. And I would think of it in terms of organizing it as, goal 1, 2, 3. Then list the money of your ask and how you want to allocate it, and how these allocations are going to help you achieve like the 3 goals you're describing. That's a nice, easy way to kind of organize everything. And then in terms of the record of success, that one actually is newer as a question, I think. Here's where I focus on any data you've collected that can make the case for your record of success. And actually, I think here's where you can have room for a personal story or an anecdotal story if you have room in the character count, and how your work fits in with the larger area of economic development if you can. But again, just always be specific with your numbers on your success, because that's what they're going to want to see. But like I said, I think you have a little wiggle room here for a qualitative kind of story. And then they're going to ask you about management and staff. With that, I would just follow the fund's tip to go beyond the resume of folks and tie in their work with the capacity of your organization and achieving your strategic goals. That's how you can kind of make more out of just the straight resume dump that kind of happens on that kind of question. And if you contract any key functions, include your contractors there and talk about maybe their skills in underwriting or financial management or portfolio management. And same with your board members. They're part of management too. So, you can talk about them addressing critical qualifications around financial management or lending or target market accountability, fundraising, marketing, etc. And even loan committees here too, because that's going to the tie-in. You can talk about at least a loan committee, which would be good, especially for those folks trying to get certified. But you can also have other committees that you want to talk about too, just depending on the size of your organization. And again, I'm going to say the same thing with that question they have on community coordination. You want to go beyond listing of partners and kind of talk about how those partnerships are going to enhance your organizational capacity to help you achieve your strategic goals. And again, I'll probably keep saying that. Always come back to your strategic goals. They're going to be what I consider your touchstone throughout the application. And provide services, of course, how those partnerships help you provide services. And finally, the last two sections you see are financial performance. And here is where your current MPS or MAPs can fit in and where you can discuss those ratios, your financial health and portfolio performance. Here you want to try to highlight your strengths and explain your weaknesses as clearly as possible and have this section match/explain what they're going to see in AMIS or explain what they might not see in AMIS. And here you have that chance to kind of give that further explanation in the narrative and try to also tie to internal financial portfolio and management goals. Also, again, I would say follow the tip from the fund here. Address capitalization, earnings, self-sufficiency, portfolio at risk, charge-offs, and loan loss reserve. If it were me, I would literally list each one of these separately and then have an explanation for each one. Unless you're a sponsoring entity or very emerging, then, obviously you might not be able to speak to that. Then I would talk about your financial position and projections and plan for the future that's positive in nature. But yeah, if you're listing each of these, talk about why each of them is strong or weak. You could also list a few extra internal health ratios that aren't listed, like higher deployment, funder diversification, higher liquidity, etc., or a few internal portfolio management ratios that aren't listed, like lower PIR, that kind of thing. Really where you can shine is where you're going to want to pick those kind of pieces. And kind of also explain how your organization has addressed any negative trends or years. And so I also wanted to touch on one of the harder financial pieces to meet as an industry. If you, one of those listed was self-sufficiency. And I wanted to say if you don't have a strong self-sufficiency ratio, you're not alone. You may lose points on that, and there's no way around it, but you also need to use this space to kind of communicate that if you're in a rural area, it's generally much harder to have a higher self-sufficiency ratio because of your target market size and the fact that you most likely have to provide a lot of development services. Make sure you provide any of these on a contractual basis, that income got categorized as earned income, not grant income, so you can count it there. Also, if you have a lot of depreciable assets on past NACAs that have hurt your self-sufficiency ratio, make sure you state that here as well. Also, if you're not showing strong figures in performance, you can address how maybe you're trending positively towards meeting them. Like maybe initially the way they're looking at the numbers might not look great, but maybe you're on an upward swing, and try to make sure you're addressing that or any of the concerns. And so then they also ask a question about organizational impact, and that's really the milestone section. Anything you've done to accomplish any of the strategic goals, big or small, you want to talk about here. And if you've received a TA award in the past, cover the impact from that as well, and follow the tip from the fund. This is really important. You should be clear you're in motion with these strategic goals before receiving the award. And this is actually, I think, is going to be critical for newer folks. So if you're a sponsoring entity or you're an emerging group, here's where you can even talk about things like maybe you're waiting for the money to come through before you can do a lot, but maybe you're able to at least start talking to people that can be board members and getting that together. That's free. I mean, it's going to be your time, but it's free. And how you could be moving towards maybe incorporating as an organization. And, just things like that you can at least say, we've started or we plan on starting between now and, a potential award coming through. They also kind of have the final question for that, which is financial and programmatic risks. And I want to point out this is 2,500 characters because It's not a lot of characters to answer this question, and this is the only time that I think they touch on projections in the TA application, so some of you will be very excited. And so for this, the fund gives good examples of potential risks that you can draw from to talk about, funding or economic changes, overestimated demand, competition, staffing, etc. I would just identify a risk and mitigation strategy for maybe 2 or 3 that best fit, and then tie them to your financial and lending projections. And here's where you can also have that space to talk about your projections in the setting and maybe most what you want to highlight or what's going to really show off your organization. Like I said, we recommend you pick 2 or 3 tops here and be really thoughtful around them, especially with that character count. And you could kind of feel free to be honest. So like, for example, if you're a small team, losing key staff is always a concern. You can be mitigating that risk through cross-training your team members so that if someone leaves, you can fulfill their functions, or through having organizational interns during the summer, etc. But the main point here is to really pick a few that keep you up at night and address how you plan on dealing with them if worst case scenario they actually happen. And so that was my that was my kind of summary of the sections in the TA application. I tried to be pretty thorough, but it is a much shorter application than the FA. And so I know a lot of you folks are actually interested in the FA, so I'm going to turn it over to Caleb, and he's going to talk about the FA application. And like I said, at the end of that, we'll make sure that we get to everybody's questions and are kind of making sure we're addressing any concerns that you are having with the application. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Caleb.
Great, thanks, Heather. So I'm going to start off the same way that Heather did, and I'll go over the first part of the scoring criteria for the FA applications. I won't go over the latter 2 tables there just in the interest of time. But one thing, well, the very first step is actually similar to what Heather outlined for the TA application. The difference here being that to apply for an FA application, you have to be a certified CDFI or you have to be applying for CDFI certification with the FA application. But the second step in the scoring criteria is actually what I really want to highlight here, because it's different than years past and very important this year. And what it is step 2 is actually the first table on the top of the slide there, and it's the financial analysis criteria for the FA applications this year. And if you don't score well enough in this section, the NACA readers don't even look at your narrative. And the way that they're scoring this is, you see those 5 categories there: the capital adequacy, asset quality, earnings, capital liquidity, and operating liquidity. I imagine that these are going to tie in with the MAPS ratios, which of course we don't know about just yet. So we'll know more about what those ratios mean when the fund makes the application live. But I just want to highlight the fact that this table is highlighting the parts of your finances that are going to function as a gatekeeper for this year's FA application. So let me move on here. So the FA, actually, as they're calling it in the FA guide and the note for this year a little bit, is the business plan. It's broken up into 7 sections. Each one is worth 7 points, and we have the executive summary, the business strategy, products and services, market and competitive analysis, management and staffing, financial position, and then growth and financial projections is the final section. And as I'll get into a little bit later in the presentation here, each section has a different number of questions. So for example, the products and services and market and competitive analysis and the management and staffing section each only have 1 question, but each section is each worth 7 points. So for those sections I just listed, each question is going to be worth 7 points. So it's going to be very important that you focus your efforts on those questions since they'll be so valuable. So I'm going to jump into the first section here, which is the executive summary. Questions 1 and 2 are more input questions. They're asking for your board-approved mission statement and information on the types of products and services that your CDFI provides. And you're going to want to lay these out well, as if the NACA readers don't know you at all. Question 3 is asking for demographic information of your clients. And it has an input section in AMIS as well as a narrative section. And there's a tip in the FA guide here that says you're going to want to talk about clients and beneficiaries here, and I won't go into the distinction just because They do that very well in the FA guide. But in the table in AMIS for this question, they want race and ethnicity information, income information, gender information, and location of your clients and beneficiaries. And then for the narrative part of this question, you're going to really want to try and paint a clear picture of the population that your CDFI serves. And you want that narrative to complement the AMIS tables. So ideally what happens here is the NACA readers look at the AMIS tables with the demographic information of your clients and beneficiaries and the narrative, and they have a really clear picture of the population that you serve. Question 4 is asking about the major needs and challenges of your target market. So question 3 was more about defining your target market. Question 4 is about the major needs and challenges of your target market. And this ties in directly with new AMIS tables required for this question, which are the classic economic indicators: median family income, unemployment, and poverty levels. So once you input those, the question 4 asks you to talk about those economic indicators and how they relate to national or state levels. And you're really going to want to focus and present a strong answer in this question, because the final scoring criteria for NACA for FA applications is economic distress and target market need. And this will be one of the questions that they refer to in evaluating that part. So you're just going to want to be really strong in this part. One last thing I want to outline about question 4 is that there's some language in the question that says it's open to supplemental statistical data. So, we're not tied down to only the AMIS tables. We're not tied down to tribal or federal or state data only. If you have market analyses, partner data, survey data, that's going to be really, really valuable here. So I will jump into the second section here. And the second section is the business strategy, and it's 7 points. It's questions 5 through 9. Question 5 is asking for what I call your ask, or your the total quantity of funding that you're asking for, and then it's asking for the breakdown of your funding need. And we already know that as a part of the application, we're breaking down for which lines of business we're going to use the funds, and if the award will be for financial products, development services, and loan loss reserves. But this year, we're also breaking down our funding use into 4 categories that are getting at how you're going to use the funding to grow. And if you remember me saying earlier from one of the earlier slides that I talked to you guys about FA objectives, that's what I'm getting to right now. These 4 categories are called the FA objectives, and they are: expand your operations into a new investment area or areas. The second one is serve a new targeted population. The third is provide additional or new products or services. And the fourth is increase the volume of current products and services. And so question 6 is actually broken up to mirror the categories of the FA objectives. So 6A is for people who will be utilizing the first FA objective. So expanding operations into a new investment area or areas. 6B is for the second FA objective, for applicants that are expecting to serve a new targeted population, and so on. Question 6 is a really important question because you're outlining specifically how you're going to grow. And also the questions are asking for how you're going to justify the need for expanding in that way or growing in that way. And you're going to want to use all different kinds of data that you have available to justify this demand. So if you've done surveying in the area or the population that you're going to expand into, that's going to be really valuable here. If you haven't done surveying, then you can rely on tribal, federal, or state data that justifies that demand. Basically, you just want to show that you've thought about this expansion, and expanding or growing in that way is a strategic decision for your native CDFI to better serve your target market. Also, I'd like to note here, if you feel like you're weak on your ability to justify the need for the growth or expansion, then maybe you write in, we're going to do a market analysis this year, or we're going to do more surveying this year, so that we get a better idea of what exactly, how exactly we should be expanding to best serve our target market. And I've kind of said different iterations of this earlier, but the FA guide says that the fund wants to see fact-based and quantifiable information in this section. So really find a way to do that. If all you have is qualitative data to justify the need for expansion, then that's going to be viewed much less favorably than fact-based quantifiable information. One other thing I wanted to say about FA objectives is that you want to be careful in the objectives that you choose, as there are some qualifications to each. So for example, the first one, the expansion into a new investment area or areas.
And Caleb, I don't want to interrupt you because I know we said we were waiting 2 years to the end, and I do see a couple of questions. I'm going to wait till the end, but I did see one that's relevant to what you're talking about.
Oh, sure,
right
yeah,
now.
let's hear it.
So Karen asked, regarding question 6, what if a strategy is hard to nail down in terms of 6A through D? That is, it really affects expansion in multiple ways, but it's hard to pinpoint in the primary one. So as you're saying that, I don't know if you can also address this.
Yeah. First of all, in response to that question, I'd like to say there's no competitive edge for choosing more than one. So if you're on the fence about which FA objective your growth or expansion fits best in, I know the decision is going to be hard, but focus on one. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I would say if you're choosing between them, but you really feel like it's affecting expansion in multiple ways, to me, if I'm being kind of more strategic about writing the application, I'm choosing the one I can make the best case in.
Mm-hmm.
What's the one, if I'm looking at all of their criteria for each A through D, which one is the one I'm making the strongest case in terms of like any data I have, anything I'm trying to do to kind of answer each of the little questions they have within those questions, each of the kind of pieces of the questions. That's what I would do. I don't know if that's very helpful, but that's how I would provide it. Because like Caleb said, there's no benefit in writing more than one. So, to me, I'm picking the one that I can make the best case in, even if there might be some other ones that also can fit.
Mm-hmm. I'd also say, and we have this on one of the earlier slides, but if you're really confused about it, AMIS has a function called service requests that you can ask questions to the CDFI fund about these kinds of things. You can also call their help desk and get in touch with somebody and get it answered that way. So if you're really confused about it, I'd advise doing that.
That's a good call, Caleb. Yeah, they're happy to answer questions. So maybe if you're just trying to, they probably won't give you the answer, but they'll give you a more nuanced response than you're getting from just kind of parsing through the question.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry to interrupt, Caleb.
Yeah, no worries. So to jump right back into it, I was just saying, be careful about which FA objectives you choose. That was really good timing for that question. So for example, the first FA objective, which is expanding into a new investment area or areas, you're not allowed to expand. You can't classify an investment area that you're expanding into if you already have more than 5% of your portfolio in that investment area. So I won't go over qualifications for each FA objective because they do that in the FA guide, but just make sure that you check up on those so that you don't choose an FA objective that actually you can't legally, or you can't actually choose. One last, and actually I kind of answered this. I was going to say one last thing to consider about these FA objectives is that they're new concepts, so confusion is going to be, they could be confusing. Questions might be expected, and feel free to reach out to the CDFI fund as those questions come up. There's another new idea to consider in this year's FA application, and that's performance goals and measures. You'll see the abbreviation PG and Ms in the FA guide quite a bit. And what these are is a tool that makes sure that unrealistic goals are not showing up on your application. So basically what you have to do for each part of question 6 is to write down goals that correspond to each FA objective that you choose. So if you've chosen the last FA objective, which is increase the volume of current products and services, you'll need to give quantified totals for the lending you expect to accomplish with your award, and quantified totals for the increase of service provision you expect to accomplish. So this just goes along with the theme of concrete numbers for the goals that you're setting out. And another thing I like to mention about this is that you will be held to these goals, so you'll want to make sure that they're realistic. There's some language in the FA guide about how if you apply for a $500,000 FA award and the goal is that you end up receiving $250,000, then the goals that you set out in the FA application will be halved just like the award was. So regardless of the size of the award, you're going to be held to what you what you outline in your application. So finally, moving on to number 7, it's a classic NACA question. It asked about your strategic goals for the application, and Heather covered this pretty thoroughly in the TA section, so I won't get into it too much here, but just be specific. So like if you plan to increase lending, just outline by how much you plan to increase that lending, you know, how fast you plan to do that. Just be specific in those regards. The new part to question 7 is talking about the relationship between your strategic goals and your FA objectives. And this should be easy to write about. The two are going to be pretty natural partners. Common strategic goals include increasing lending and increasing provision of development services, which ties in really easily with all of the FA objectives. Another common strategic goal for NACA is increasing an MPS or a MAPS if you're weak in one of those. And basically you could ask yourself, how do my FA objectives stand to increase my self-sufficiency, for example? And being able to talk about this concretely shows that your native CDFI is being strategic and thoughtful about the use of the award. And as with all parts of the application, concrete numbers are advisable here. Going back to the self-sufficiency example, you're just going to want to outline exactly how you plan to increase earned revenue through one of your FA objectives. So just don't be too vague. Moving on to number 9, that's another classic NACA question, and just like question 6, it has some new stuff in there for fiscal year 2017, this year's application. The part of it that we have seen before is the discussion of risks that could undercut your strategic goals and how you expect to mitigate those. And I won't touch on this just because Heather did a really good job of that in the TA section. But the second part of question 9 is asking about any risks that may inhibit you from achieving FA objectives. And of course, this part's new because FA objectives are new. So depending on the relationship between your strategic goals and the FA objectives that you select, these risks that you write into 9B might be the same as 9A. And to help create a distinction, I would advise thinking about 9B in terms of what are the risks that are really going to make it hard for you to grow, because that's what the FA objectives are focused on, is how you're going to grow. So if you can, try and separate the risks that you see as more general and the risks that are going to prevent you from growing, and talk about those that are going to prevent you from growing in 9B. Perfect. So we'll move on to section 3 here.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to move on, and I'm actually going to pause really quickly and just answer some of the questions we have, just because we're at the end of the hour, and that way, since we're going to go over a little bit, I can kind of catch some of those questions before some people might have to jump off. So I see a couple of questions. One says, if we're submitting a certification application and we are currently on our 3rd year of TA uncertified, do we fill out section 1 as uncertified or complete as we are certified? So if you're in the process of submitting a certification application, you're technically still uncertified. So what I would do is fill out section 1 and assume that you're uncertified as your status, just because you haven't gotten a determination yet from the fund. And I also see a question, is it typical to have a person sought out for a new position as we will be creating and including them in the grant? You can absolutely write somebody like a loan officer or something into the NACA grant. You don't have to have them picked out or anything yet, but I would be specific about what that position is going to do for your organization, how it's going to build your capacity, and how it's going to fit your strategic goals. So I think as long as you do that, you're going to be fine. And then we also we're still waiting for a code to set up grants.gov and AMIS. Are the narrative questions in the TA application guidance the same as the real ones in the application? I'd like to start working on the narrative while I wait. Great question. The questions are, as far as I know, because I haven't seen it either, are going to be the same. This guidance is what the questions are going to be. And in fact, what we can do after this is share a TA and FA document that we put together. Like, we put the questions from that PDF into a Word doc that you can work from. And I think that'll be a good tool as you're trying to kind of get started right away on writing. And then finally, we had a pretty complex question from Karen that was saying the CDFI fund has expressed a specific interest in portfolio expansion. How literal is this? So let's say a CDFI uses CDFI funding to serve its core business and leverages that to be able to broaden its reach in terms of population, geography, and products. However, let's say the product, like HUD 184 loans in this example, is brokered out, so it won't necessarily be reflected in the CDFI loan portfolio. but it seems to me they're still meeting the intent, which is to get more loan products out to more underserved populations, particularly, in this case, American Indian, Alaska Native population. What's the thinking on this? And so we brought in Crystal Langholz to kind of help answer some of the questions around this.
Hi. So I just wanted to give you what insight I could here. I was on a panel with the fund where they were asking for feedback specifically around their kind of new direction and how they're going to be scoring. And I gave some very specific feedback around this issue. And so, you know, I just want to, I think, reiterate what you've probably already been hearing, that the fund is really trying to score and really trying to award awards kind of in line with those statutory FA objectives that they were originally given according to their language. And so, you know, those four things that you guys probably already talked about, expanding operations into the new investment areas, serving a new target population, providing additional or new products or services, and increasing volume are really the tools that they are going to be using to think through making the awards. And the awards will be completely driven by the economic distress, the proposed activities, expanding economic opportunities, and the need to which a CDFI is increasing its impact through other partnerships. So I think in the example that was asked, I think it would be pretty easy to frame that as increasing its impact through partnerships, even as that's an activity that is going to be one that, but I would also be thinking about how it fits under the other areas too. So, you know, is it a new product and services? You know, is it increasing volume maybe of your development services? Trying to frame anything you can under those specific things. But to me, you know, my part of my feedback to the fund was around kind of these ideas that you know, with a lot of our NACA clients, we tend to go really deep with our relationships, not necessarily broad in our services. And I think it's actually risky, right, if we all start writing in a whole bunch of new services that we're going to be providing, and I'll have some sort of like mission drift that's starting to happen as we try to increase all of everything that we're doing to access the fund's resources. And so I think you also just want to be careful with that. And I think it's about how you frame it to line up with those statutory objectives, not necessarily trying to come up with tons of new things. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but that's how I would think through that question. And you know, and the fund is pretty responsive if you have specific questions. But I hope that gives you a little bit of help and insight.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Crystal. So I will jump right back into the third section of the FA application here, and that is the products and services section. It's 7 points, and it's only one question. So this is one of those examples that I was referencing earlier, where it's not like the first two sections where there's 4 or 5 questions in each. So question 10 is effectively worth 7 points, and so really important that you do a good job on this. Some key language that I see in the FA guide about this question is, you know, everything that I've said before, is that they want responses to this question to be evidence-based and factual. So make sure you have really good quantifiable data in there. That being said, I actually think that with the character count considered for this question, it is the best opportunity for some qualitative data, and you are outlining the short-term and long-term outcomes that your products and services have in your community. So I think it's the best time for a success story, which would, you know, be more of a qualitative side to your answer. So I'm actually going to move on to the fourth section here, which is the market and competitive analysis section. In this one, you're asked to identify trends and or primary competitors in your target market. And the context provided in the FA guide says that this question is in the application because the fund wants to understand your awareness of your target market and your place within your target market. So I would use very sure language here, which is to say just use sentences like "we know that" rather than "we think that." Also, since the FA application is focused mostly on lending and growth, note those trends and the competitors in those markets specifically before you list anything else. If there's room for other discussion, then go ahead and note other trends, but that's what I would say you do first. One final reminder for this question is that you have to know where you're getting your data from. Since these are popular topics in market analyses, they can be cited for this question, but a good rule of thumb is that market analyses older than 5 years are no longer very relevant. So we'll move on to section 5 here.
There you go.
Section 5 is called Management and Staffing. It's another one of those that's only one question, 7 points. First thing that I'd say about this question is there's some Amos tables that need filled out for this question, some drop-down questions. And in regards to answering this, I'd say if your CDFI needs to alter its policies and procedures to be able to expand in the way that you outline in the application, I would go ahead and note that. Your policies might already be solid, so no changes needed, but you may have updated some of your procedures internally to account for this growth that you're talking about. The thing that I would just warn against in this question is that I think it'd be really easy to just say, no, we're not planning on doing that. But I think that that would go against the idea that the growth and expansion that you're outlining in your application has been strategic and thought out. I think if you haven't done anything to your policies and procedures, I think it's wise to say, we plan to, and this is how we plan to, and maybe here's how our day-to-day operations have already changed.
Or I was even going to add, maybe this is how we've evaluated our policies, and we found that this was comprehensive enough to cover our expansion. But like Caleb was saying, maybe our procedures, our day-to-day stuff is where we made our tweaks. But yeah, still touch on it, like say that maybe you've reviewed it, even if you didn't have to change it.
Great. So that's moving on to section 6, which is the financial position. This one's 7 points, and we're back into the sections that have more than one question in them. I mean, as we've already said, the NPS and the MAPS ratios aren't out yet, so we don't know specifically how this question is going to look. That being said, for question 13, you're asked to discuss how you view your current financial position, and you'll want this view to be in accordance with how you're doing on those ratios. And what I mean to say is that you just don't want to say that you're faring excellently in regards to your finances when you actually fail some of your MAPs or most of your MAPs or NPSs. The NACA readers are intelligent folks, and if you don't discuss something that they see as a problem, then they're going to notice. So it bodes well for you to show that you are aware of your financial problems if you have any, and if you have any, that you have a plan to fix them. So an example of this might be if you've remained stagnant on the self-sufficiency NPS for the last couple of years, be sure to discuss why you've remained stagnant and how you plan to grow in that area. If you've trended positively with respect to your finances, and this is reflected in your MAPS ratios, I discuss how you have accomplished that and how you plan to even further capitalize on those positive trends. And even though this section 6, has 4 questions in it, question 13 is really the meat of the section. 14, 15, and 16 are just asking you to discuss if you or your parent company have had any audit findings, or if you filed bankruptcy, or if you've formally defaulted on any outstanding debt. So I won't actually talk about those, just question 13. So moving on to section 7, this section should complement your financial projections very well. This idea applies to all of the questions in this section. NACA readers should just be able to move back and forth from your projections and the narrative around your projections, or the narrative that's going to be in the section, and they shouldn't be getting confused or lost. Like, they should see totals in your projections and see exactly where those are fitting in the narrative. Also, I mentioned this earlier, you want to make sure that your operations grow in a way that makes sense with all the lending growth. So if you project a lot of lending growth over the next 3 years, your expenses will likely need to grow as well, especially if you plan on bringing on new staff to support the growth or expansion that you're going to be taking on. Question 17 wants to know how the FA award will build, increase, or augment your ability to reach your strategic goals and FA objectives. And again, here you see the focus on growth with the FA award. So I'd make sure to talk about the new things, and I have new bolded in my notes here. so you're going to want to talk about the new things that your organization will be able to do with the FA award.
And I wanted to add to that, if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think Caleb's making a really good point here. The fund is kind of said over and over, especially you can see it with the way they've developed this application, in that they're really focused on those 4 ways you're growing, and so that's really what they want to speak to. They don't want to give awards to kind of keep you going. They want to give you awards to grow in different ways, and so I just wanted to hammer that home with Caleb was saying, that really is an important piece to focus on.
Good point, Heather. So for question 18, this question is asking about your plans to increase production goals for current staff or to bring on new staff. And you're going to want the overall story of your application to match this question, which is to say that if you detail in other parts of the narrative that you're currently stretched thin, staffing-wise, then you won't want to talk about how you're going to increase lending and development service provision without bringing on new staff. The NACA readers are going to see that distinction, or that contradiction, rather. Finally, question 19 is talking about your financial and lending projections and how they align with your strategic goals. And this is also probably a very natural relationship. Many of native CDFI strategic goals are financial or lending goals. And I would be, just as I have with other questions, I'd advise being very specific in this question. There's actually AMIS input for this question that asks for lending number totals and lending dollar totals for each year of your performance period. So you're just going to want to use that narrative that says, in the first year of the performance period, we'll close on this many loans for a total of X dollars. Moving on to question 20, it's asking about the rationale behind each of your projected figures that correspond to the main items on your financial statement, so assets, liabilities, net assets, income, and expenses. And that's, it's going to be the same story as before. You're going to want to be able to describe exactly how you've arrived to those totals. And this kind of works with what Heather was saying earlier about how it makes sense to do your financial projections first, because then when you're doing your narrative, you can actually have sentences in there that say, you know, we expect X amount of income in this year because we're going to be doing all these different things. The final question details how you're going to combine and leverage the FA award to accomplish your goals. And it's a 3-part question. So A is asking, are you going to be using it to access more capital? Will you be using it to, the second part is, will you be using it to build partnerships? And I see this as being fairly open-ended. So, for example, like non-capital leveraging, you could say, I have funding to support training and partnership with this organization, and then with that partnership, they're going to be able to bring something new to the table for us. So yes, that's the final question.
Perfect. That was awesome, Caleb. That's a lot to get through. So yeah, but we wanted to make sure we were as thorough as possible while trying to fit in with our time frame. So now we kind of want to wrap it up in terms of just going over some final tips, and then also kind of answering any final questions. So here's the time where if you want to like put some questions in the box, we see some in already. If you had your hand raised, go ahead and put your question into the question box too, and we'll try to make sure we answer all of that. And then if, you know, maybe you think of something later, obviously feel free to shoot us an email or call us and we can answer any questions there. I see one question here. It says, is it a problem if we just received our EIN and are just opening accounts? Therefore, we do not have any assets for the financial section. So definitely not a problem if you just received your EIN, and Caleb can definitely speak to the financial piece in there. She was saying they just received, they're just opening accounts, they don't have any assets for the financial section.
So you're only required to input the historical financials that you have. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we see a lot of groups only have 1 year. If you have 0 years, then you just won't have any historical financials. So, and we see that with groups, so it's not something that you have to be overly worried about.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm just going to go over some final tips. And like I said, as you have questions, just go ahead and type them in to make sure we get to them. So final tips, obviously address any big weaknesses that you have that are going to come up in there. Make sure that you're kind of making the best case possible for those places where you, like we were saying, if in AMIS the numbers might be showing one thing and you want to explain it, that's where you want to make sure that you kind of use the narrative. Cite all your sources. these are just little tips, but they're just kind of good things to kind of hammer home at the end of all the more specific pieces we talked about. Answer all the questions asked, and I really can't stress this enough, answer every part of the question and exactly what they're asking, because that's just something we see all the time, and you don't want that to trip you up in terms of your scoring. Don't do it alone. If you can, reach out to partners or staff or your board, etc., for assistance or feedback or just another set of eyes, especially in AMIS or with your narrative. Again, we said this kind of throughout, but be clear and concise. Meat on the bones, but no fat. Like, try to really just get to the point and being clear and making it as easy for the readers as possible so that they're in a good mood when they're reading your application. And I'm sure that, affects your scoring positively if you've made it easier for them to wade through. And imagine that they don't know you, they don't know anything about your organization, because I know that when I'm doing reviews of different applications, I even know some of the organizations, and I'll read through and be like, what is their product? What is their service? So just kind of think about that when you're writing. Triple check your math, and we said this with the figures in AMIS too. Anywhere that you can triple check your math or triple check your figures when you're inputting is going to be huge.
On that topic, Heather, not to interrupt.
Oh, you're fine.
AMIS, last year they had a cool function where when you input your financials and then you click save, you could scroll down to the bottom of that page and see how you're faring with the NPS ratios. So if they have something similar this year, that's a really helpful tool.
Oh, cool. Thank you, Caleb. And then finally, just submit early. Like we said, that SF424 deadline is approaching March 24th, and it's the same with the NACA application itself. Make sure you're submitting early. It's going to be huge for cutting down on stress and avoiding and addressing some potential submission issues that we talked about, especially with the way the AMIS system is set up. So that's just always a tip that we like to put out there. Yeah, and I'm just going to, again, leave some time here if there's any questions that come through. We tried to answer some as we went along, so there might not be any, but I saw some hands raised, so I don't know if you want to submit a question or not. So we'll give you a little bit of time here and just give you maybe like a minute or so. Cool. Well, I'm not seeing any come through, and like I said, feel free to email or call us. What I'm going to do then is kind of just let you know about our upcoming webinar that's going to be on loan packaging, Friday, March 31st at 12 p.m. We have our registration in our event section, and I just want to thank everybody for taking the time, especially because we went over our time. There's lots to cover, but taking the time to kind of spend this with us and learn more about the NACA application and have really good questions. And yeah, have a great day. And yeah, like I said, I can't say it enough. Feel free to call or email us with any questions throughout the process, and have a wonderful day.